Welcome, everybody. My name is Daniel Rothenberg. I co-direct the Future Security Initiative, which is a partnership between Arizona State University and New America, a DC-based think tank. We're really thrilled that you're joining us this evening. This evening's event is How Did the U.S. Fail in Afghanistan? In-depth reporting on America's longest war. Tonight's event is also co-sponsored by the Center for Law and Global Affairs at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law here at ASU. And we're really thrilled to have two longstanding colleagues and friends of our program. Matt Aikins, who's contributing writer for New York Times Magazine, the winner of the 2025 and 2022 Pulitzer Prizes for reporting on US policies in Afghanistan. He wrote a really excellent book called The Naked Don't Fear the Water, An Underground Journey with Afghan Refugees. And he was a former Eric and Wendy Schmidt Fellow, as well as a Southern New Hampshire University Fellow at New America. And good news is that he just sold a new book with a tentative title of American Vigilantes, which is focusing on US special operations in Afghanistan and a number of related issues having to do with the US war in Afghanistan. And that builds on a really major New York Times Magazine piece that maybe you've all seen. We'll hopefully have a chance to talk about that. We also have Anand Gopal, who's a key member of our team, an assistant research professor at the Future Security Initiative and the Center for Study of Religion and Conflict. He's also a senior fellow at New America, a finalist for the 2015, 2022, and 2025 Pulitzer Prizes for reporting on the impact of conflict in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and Syria. He's the author of really one of the best books about Afghanistan, No Good Men Among the Living, the Taliban, America, Taliban, and the War Through Afghan Eyes. He has a book coming out about the Syrian conflict, which talks about a lot of big issues as seen through some in-depth reporting there, called Days of Love and Rage, that will come out soon. So we're thrilled to have both Anand and Matt with us, and thank you all for joining us. I'd like to start, if you could maybe give us a sense of how each of you who've reported in such detailed manner in Afghanistan for so many years during like various turbulent times, from when the Afghan conflict was covered daily in the US press to where it's gotten to the stage it's at now, maybe largely forgotten, or at least not on everybody's minds. So if you could give us a sense of how you both began working in Afghanistan and what that experience was like.
Anand, why don't you start since you went there first?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So I got to Afghanistan in 2008, and I actually went there initially because I thought I would be teaching English. I went to a place that I had signed up for online, and when I got to the location, it turned up that it was boarded up, and it actually had been a scam. I had been had, and so I was basically in the country with $1,000, and uh, so I said I might as well stay here. So I just kind of putzed around for a little bit and then slowly began to write. What ended up happening is that when I started to write, because I didn't come as a journalist attached to a bureau, I didn't have the infrastructure behind me, for example, with a fixer or translator or driver, etc. So I was kind of forced by dint of circumstance to learn the languages very quickly and kind of go off the beaten path a little bit. And so I ended up spending a lot of time in the countryside, in the South, where much of the war was being fought. And it turned out to be fortuitous that I came through this route because I ended up being able to see a side of the conflict that I probably wouldn't have had access to if I'd gone the traditional route. And so what it means, I was living in the rural areas and seeing the everyday violence being meted out by the U.S. occupation forces, by the people that the U.S. occupation forces were supporting at the time, and violence committed by the Taliban. So very quickly, it kind of attuned me to a different story than I think I would have gotten otherwise. And that was the beginning. That was 2008. I lived in Afghanistan for 3 years. And then since I left, I've been going back repeatedly over the years.
Well, I also, like Anand, come from a fairly non-traditional background to Afghanistan. Although it's funny, I didn't realize, I didn't know all of this backstory to Anand during Afghanistan. When we first met was in June 2010, when he was a correspondent at the Wall Street Journal. And I remember seeing him walk into this expat restaurant wearing a suit. And I remember thinking, oh, this guy's a real establishment journalist. And he'd already reported on some pieces that I'd read, and I admired his work. But very quickly, I discovered a kindred soul in terms of someone who was traveling in the rural areas where the real conflict was taking place, and trying to understand, a side of the country that wasn't as easy to access. I had come also in 2008, though, at the very end. I'd come overland from Europe. I was fresh out of college and hitchhiking and backpacking, trying to get to India, but I got to Afghanistan and discovered that I could blend in because of my, half Asian background, and started traveling around the country. And I met some drug traffickers who turned out to be working with one of the main U.S. backed commanders in the South, Abdul Razak. And so I spent some time with them, and that was my first real story about Afghanistan that I published in Harper's Magazine. And so that was also my sort of entry. My window into the conflict was not from, the point of view of an embed or the embassies in Kabul, but kind of from the periphery with some of the warlords that were leading the fight against the Taliban. And then I ended up also living in Afghanistan for about 8 years, from 2008 to 16. And then I was back in 2021 during the evacuation, and have been, since the collapse of the Republic and the rise of the Taliban, have been going back and forth trying to take advantage of some of the new opportunities that exist in the country for access to places you couldn't get to and people you couldn't talk to before.
So you've spent a lot of time, both of you, in areas that were not as well traveled by foreign journalists. Um, can you give us a sense of what it is that you saw, what you reported on, that was being missed by the American public? Maybe Matt, you want to start? And then...
Well, I mean, where to start, really? I think it was something I've been thinking about lately. The sort of way that the perception of something like a war changes over time, and in some ways, it's hard to fully appreciate in retrospect, because I think that many of the opinions, or these understandings of why the war was failure, or why it was maybe doomed from the start, have become almost common sense positions. Um, but they weren't when I arrived in the country, or when Anand arrived. And I can remember feeling like we were very much outsiders with in terms of, let's say, our very skeptical views of the troop surge, whether this is going to work, um, of our understanding of the extensive human rights abuses, and other forms of um, corruption and violence that were being carried out by the Afghan government. Um, and or just a sense that how limited the perspective was, that people had in the war, that it was they were looking at it through this very narrow segment of Afghan society that was mostly based around the urban centers, particularly in Kabul. And over time, I think people came around, and they began to see more and more of, the other side of the war. They began to understand the Taliban weren't some, like, foreign group, or puppets of Pakistan, but that they had a real enduring base in segments of Afghan society, and weren't going to be easily, defeated with a better military strategy. And so that eventually, I think, became a kind of commonplace wisdom. And I'm not saying this to pat ourselves on the back. I think it's really important, actually, that we understand why, certain forms of knowledge, like, are not really understood, or accessible at certain stages in a conflict, and at what point, what causes them to become sort of acceptable later on. And I think a really fantastic example of this is the piece that Anand did in the New Yorker, called "The Other Afghan Women," which was about, the perspectives and experiences of rural Pashtun women in the South. And that that article, was a fantastic, incredible piece of reporting, but it also had a reception, I think. It appeared in the New Yorker, and I don't think that piece, maybe Anand will disagree with me, but I don't think that piece could have appeared, you know, 10 years earlier. And I don't think some of the stories I wrote for the New York Times would have appeared 10 years earlier. And I think it's really important to understand, what why that is, because it's important for understanding how our society works and how we understand what's happening in the present, right?
Can I ask both of you then to build on your point, Matt? At what year or around what time did you get a sense that the U.S. vision of Afghanistan was doomed to failure, if you in fact felt that? Anna, maybe?
Well, I can answer that by going off what Matt had said, which is so when I got to Afghanistan in 2008, I spent a couple of months in Kabul, and then went to Kandahar, and it really was like you're going to a different country. Of course, there was violence in Kabul. There were car bombs or suicide attacks, but for the most part, the city of Kabul, the population there was thriving. And then when I went to the villages in Kandahar, it was an ex totally different world where violence was every day. It touched every man, woman, and child. There wasn't a household that I visited that didn't have somebody who was affected by violence. What shocked me was just the degree of killing. Most of these deaths, by the way, I think still to this date haven't been properly accounted for. So you'll see numbers bandied about the number of civilians who've died in the war, and I think that's almost certainly a gross underestimate of the actual death toll. Many of these killings were meted out by U.S. allies or the U.S. themselves, or the result of car bombs or Taliban executions, etc. And what I realized at that moment, since mid 2008, is that I would go to these villages where every single person um, supported in one way or the other the Taliban. Maybe they didn't love the Taliban, but they saw them as a lesser of two evils compared to the US-backed government. And when I saw that back in 2008, I realized that the war is doomed to fail at that point. I think if you had asked me at that point, what would have happened if the US had stopped, US troops had pulled out and had stopped supporting the Afghan military, I probably would have said it would have continued, the Afghan military would have held on for some time, for a couple of years. But ultimately, I would have expected a kind of chaotic collapse like we did see in 2021. So I actually think that the war was lost much earlier than 2008, in the early years of the conflict, when there's multiple different paths that the conflict could have gone. But because of a particular nature of the violence perpetuated by the US in those early years, in 2002, 2003, it wasn't that they killed a lot of people, but the types of people that they killed were such that it was destroying the fabric of local communities, killing certain leaders, tribal elders, etc. And there became a kind of path dependence after that point where it was very hard, I think, to undo what was done. So to me, in 2008 and 2009, it was pretty clear that the war was doomed.
Matt, what about you? Did you have a sense? At what stage did you have a sense that this was doomed to fail?
I think because I so quickly encountered Abdul Razik, this border police commander who was a key U.S. ally, who was also committing human rights abuses, killing and torturing and disappearing people and smuggling drugs. So that immediately made me skeptical of the narrative that we're building something that's going to be sustainable or viable. Other that we should give more money and arms to these kinds of people. But I would say, I mean, if I look back, I think there's probably two very significant moments for me um, in terms of understanding how the war was failing. And I think the first was, if you remember, in 2010, there was the host nations trucking scandal, where basically the U.S. discovered, that they were funding the Taliban. They were paying all this money to like bring in their logistics by road, and it hired Afghan security companies or private security companies to guard these convoys, and the convoys are paying money to the Taliban. And it was, I think, symbolic of the way that the intervention was self-defeating in many ways. It was creating um, more problems that it was solving, the more money and troops you surged in, the more that violence and corruption and instability were actually being exacerbated. So, so that was one really important moment where that drove home, I think, the futility of some of the strategy that was being used. And then the second was Kunduz in 2015. So if you remember in 2015, a year after the combat mission had supposedly ended, and the U.S. troops were now just advising the Afghan army and security forces who were going to stand on their own. It quickly became apparent that they weren't able to do that. And the Taliban made significant advances. And then in the fall of 2015, this northern city of Kunduz was attacked by the Taliban, and the entire Afghan, security forces basically fled and escaped to the airport. And it really was, in retrospect, a kind of chilling preview of what happened in 2021. But just this like sudden dynamic of collapse that showed that the instability ran much deeper than maybe we understood. And in this case, of course, the United States was able to send in the special forces and to fight and take back the city. They ended up destroying a Doctors Without Borders hospital in an airstrike, but they did take back the city. And that, I think, to me was the second major event.
And how is it possible, do you think, if you can reflect on this, that the US, with so much extraordinary investment of time and personnel, intelligence capabilities, et cetera, was unable to see what you all saw? Or do you think that they saw this and just politically didn't have the ability to act on it?
Well, I think there were some people who saw it up and down the chain, but there was powerful political prerogatives and other incentives to be willfully blind to this reality. I think there was an underlying almost structural incoherence to the entire war project, which was, on the one hand, it was a putative nation building or state building project. On the other hand, it was a counterterrorism mission. Often these two aims were at cross purposes to one another. And when they were in tension, there was always a counterterrorism that was privileged, which meant that for every bit of money or support that was going to propping up the government in Kabul, there was just as much support going to warlords, people like Abdul Razik and others, that would undermine the ability to create a sort of responsive, robust nation state. And so that structural contradiction was baked in from the very beginning. And then you had just you know people, whether political officers, military officials, et cetera, who are coming in doing their tours and having to deal with the contradiction as it was given to them. So once it got started, I think it was very difficult for people to really do anything about it, except for leaders who had a lot of power. But at that point, there was a lot of political considerations to keep things going. I think, I've had, Matt, I'm sure it's the case with you. You've had conversations, I'm sure, with people who, in their more honest moments, would acknowledge that some of the things we're saying.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you look back, at some of these accounts that have come out, it seems clear that there were people in the Obama administration, in 2008, who were deeply skeptical that the war could be won in the sense of defeating the Taliban and leaving the Afghan government on, to stand up on its own. Joe Biden, Doug Lute, even the president himself, and yet for reasons of political expediency, he went along with the consensus demands of the national security establishment. And those people, I think some of them did genuinely believe that they had figured out this kind of, the best and the brightest had figured out a technocratic solution to solve the war. And we've, of course, seen that story before in American history, but it's complicated on a number of fronts. I mean, I think there was also just the inertia of this machine that a lot of people were profiting off of, Afghan power brokers, but also tons of people in the Beltway who are making some of the enormous amounts of money that were spent on the war. But there's also other processes of kind of self-mystification, you could almost say, that I'm been interested in some of my more recent work. I think there was ways that certain contradictions or sort of unpalatable or even unspeakable truths about the war had to be kind of mystified and wished away or even lied about, and that whole process of doing so um, made it harder for people to see what was actually going on. For example, I think the whole rhetoric about hearts and minds was really a kind of myth about what the war actually, what the war was. What the war was a brutal, violent counterinsurgency that was happening, being fought between people like Abdul Razik and the Taliban, who were both committing atrocities. And so we blinded ourselves to that. We blinded ourselves to the ability of the Afghan army and police to fight on their own. There was very clearly like massaged statistics that were being fed back and accepted by different levels of the command. So all of that, I think, creates a culture of like sort of dishonesty that helped blind people to the collapse that was coming. By the same token, I would say that the Afghan government, the republic, in many ways, fell victim to its own propaganda about the Taliban. The Taliban were, terrorists who had no real support from Afghan society, and as a result, they weren't able to see clearly until it was much too late just how strong the movement had become.
So what do you think about the often repeated gains of this massive investment, not only in the military effort, but in the reconstruction of the country, incredible shifts in basic healthcare statistics, in literacy rates in children, both boys and girls going to school. We're all sort of familiar with these numbers. They used to be bandied about a lot when there was more coverage of Afghanistan. Um, so briefly, how substantive were those changes for Afghans, do you think? That is to say, not just Afghans in the capital. Um, and then also, maybe you could reflect in a related point on just the general issue of Afghan women, which became a kind of rallying cry for the justification and legitimacy of Western efforts.
Yeah, I mean those gains are real. I mean, maybe let's leave aside the precise numbers; those are often inflated. But there was real gains that were made in Afghanistan to particular communities. There was extraordinary amounts of wealth that poured into the country that was then captured by Afghan communities. There was development, literacy, as you mentioned. Those were all real gains. Now, the tragedy of Afghanistan is that those gains were possible because of the continued conflict that was happening. So it was such that the gains for certain communities in certain urban areas could only persist because there was a brutal, horrible war being fought in other areas. And so it was the idea that these gains could be somehow separated from the negative side, I think, is a mistaken one. And what was, I think, the calculus ultimately of the political class for much of the war is that the political costs of continuing the conflict were not so great. And I mean, we didn't have a massive anti-war movement on the streets here against about Afghanistan the way there was for Iraq, right? And there wasn't a significant sort of political bloc calling for withdrawal of Afghanistan for most of those years. So the political costs are fairly low. And so if there could be gains that could be touted, even if there was some sort of bloody counterpoint to that, I think that was a calculus that many leaders, Obama in particular, was willing to take. It really took Trump in 2016 to blow that wide open, I think. And what Trump realized is that even if there wasn't active opposition to the war, and there certainly was not active opposition to the war among the DC blob or the political class, there was a lot of cynicism in the American public towards these never-ending wars. And there was an anger in the American public that was kind of latent about such wars. And so he was able to tap into that and run on this America First platform. And so I think he blew everything wide open. He engendered a fissure in the ruling class of this country on the question of Afghanistan. And that's really what paved the way for the possibility of a withdrawal under Biden, I think.
Matt, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo what Anand said, which is that there were real gains, but it was in the face of tremendous suffering because of the war. The the extraordinary amount, it's only with the extraordinary amounts of international expenditure that you had these gains. And I think if you hadn't had a conflict, you could have had similar gains with a much less, smaller scale investment, and it would have been lasting. I mean, what has happened to those gains? Right now, Afghanistan is a country that's under, a isolated totalitarian dictatorship. It's under sanctions. Many of the people who benefited the most from, the international occupation are now refugees. And so it's hard to say that, most of those gains, many of those gains have not lasted, it's sad to say.
Before we take questions from the audience, and when we get to that stage, please just drop them into the box at the bottom of Zoom. Maybe each of you could give us a sense of this idea of an alternate path. What do you think could have possibly been done differently? And at what stage would that have had to happen? And what might have been a better outcome for Afghans and maybe even also for U.S. and U.S. policymakers?
Well, wait a second. We're journalists. We don't come up with solutions. We just problems, and leave them for other people to solve.
Fair answer. Anand, any sense of a time period when there might have been an alternate path, if not a policy prescription?
Well, these are all counterfactuals are hard to say, but I think that in the first year or so of the invasion and occupation, the situation was that the Taliban were completely defeated, and most of them in the first, let's say, the first 6 to 8 months of 2002, most of them individually tried to switch sides and join the Afghan government, or just quit and go home and sit at home. There was no organized resistance to the U.S. military presence, and in those early years, there was a lot of support among Afghans for the U.S. military presence, a lot of goodwill as well. And instead of either leaving their former enemies, the Taliban, alone, letting them live in peace, or even trying to bring some of them into the fold, what instead happened is that many of them were targeted, arrested or tortured or killed, and then many others were targeted, falsely accused of being linked to Taliban, sent to Guantanamo, sent to Bagram, tortured. The U.S. allied with warlords and started paying them for intelligence, and this incentivized false intelligence. So as I said before, this counterterrorism paradigm, which was there from the very beginning, the problem it created was that even when there was no enemy to fight, the Taliban was defeated, it needed to find enemies. It kind of created the very enemies that it believed was there all along. And so if there had been a different paradigm in which there was a political settlement between the various sides at that point, 20-year civil war in Afghanistan, that means the Taliban, Northern Alliance, other various groups, subnational actors, if there had been some kind of settlement there, maybe there would have been a chance for peace. Maybe there would have been a chance for, and who knows how the country could have looked like. Maybe the country wouldn't have held as one unified country. I don't know, but maybe there would have been a chance for peace.
A question here from Justin.
I do want something down. I was just kidding. I think that, I agree with what Anand says about the early period, and as you go on further, it gets harder and harder to think about what might have changed the way that things worked out. But that being said, I do think that the surge was just a colossal error, and again one that was largely driven by political considerations in the United States. It escalated the violence and exacerbated, I think, a lot of deep-seated problems of the instability and corruption of the political system in Kabul, without obviously, creating military success. So again, a lighter footprint, a less aggressive, violent strategy in 2008 might have been a better path. I also think that the West made tremendous mistakes in terms of how the Afghan political system was established, how it was how the country's political parties and constitution were set up, and how elections were managed. Without getting into the details, you had these massively damaging disputed elections, right, for both president and parliament, that I think sapped a lot of energy from the country's political class, set them against each other, energies that might have been used, if there had been some more of a push for a peaceful settlement negotiations earlier on, with the Taliban and other armed groups. But it was a long shot, And I think we should remember that we're not actually looking at the worst case scenario in Afghanistan right now. It's actually, in my opinion, better that the Taliban took power so quickly and that we didn't have a devastating, protracted civil war like we did in the 90s, which we would have seen much higher levels of death and human suffering. So things could have been worse, and they still could be for Afghanistan as well in the future.
Could you also comment before we take questions on the substantial shift in military operations in Afghanistan, which is to say, in 2014, the pullback of troops on the ground and the reliance on air power and special operations, which reduced, the way the war looked like a war for Americans. But interestingly, at least if the data is correct, it coincides with higher civilian casualty rates. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think that's true. You had higher civilian casualty rates from airstrikes because you had a greater reliance on airstrikes. I mean, I don't know if that was necessarily. I don't know if like a huge U.S. troop footprint on the ground was helpful. I don't know if that again, like as we were talking about the even the logistics of it, the way that fed conflict and corruption. So civilian casualties are unfortunate, but I don't know if that shift in itself was destabilizing.
Yeah, if I could just, Dan, if I could add to that, I mean, civilian casualties on a moral level is awful, right? But if we think about analytically, what role do civilian casualties play in Afghanistan? Go back to the early period. It wasn't the case in 2001 to 2003 that the absolute number of civilians that were killed matched anything like what happened in 2014, 2015. But the identity or the nature of the civilians that were killed in 2002, 2003 had a profoundly important effect on the subsequent course of the conflict, right? So, for instance, there would be a particular tribal elder in a village that was killed. And in the way Afghanistan is structured is often in every given village, there would be a local elite or tribal elder who villagers would rely upon to intercede with Kabul or with higher authorities. So that would be an important node for in a network of patronage, in a network of goods and services that would flow from the center to the periphery. And the U.S. often killed these nodes. They often killed all these tribal elders. So the total number of them that they killed was not that high compared to later. But what that ended up doing is it severed a lot of these communities from the center, and it made them more susceptible to looking at alternative forms of patronage, alternative forms of military protection. And that's where the Taliban were able to take root in these communities.
Question here from the audience from Justin Cooker. Is there any way we could have approached militarily or politically in a different fashion that would have allowed Afghan government to be more successful, here with a focus on less corrupt? So maybe you could talk a little bit about the nature of the corruption and sort of what might have minimized this.
Well, just going up the last point, I think the biggest driver of corruption in Afghanistan was U.S. spending and the way that U.S. Money was spent. This was a extremely poor country with very little capacity to absorb the billions upon billions of dollars that are being thrown into the country. And a lot of that money, some of that money went towards institution building, but a lot of that money also went to the informal sector, to strongmen, to warlords, etc. And so this engendered corruption to degrees that country had never seen. If you talk to Afghans about corruption and compare it to how it was under the Soviets or previous eras, I mean, of course, there was always corruption, but the magnitude of corruption under the U.S. was really just extraordinary. And again, it goes back, I think, to the way in which the U.S. conceived of fighting this war. Okay, so I said before that there was a counterterrorism mission and a nation building mission. But even if you go a little bit earlier to that, if you look at the changes in the U.S. military in the 1990s, the downsizing of military functions, the privatization of some of these functions, outsourcing some of functions that used to be central core military functions to third-party actors, so logistics and other things. So that begins to happen in the mid to late 90s. And so Afghanistan becomes really the first test case for this new model of what you might want to call like a neoliberal mode of fighting war. And so when the US comes to Afghanistan, they're now sending contracts out for people to protect their bases. Matt mentioned the host nation trucking for people to bring supplies to their bases. There was basically a mad scramble for these contracts. People were now accusing each other of being Taliban or Al Qaeda to eliminate business competition. So it really created a kind of bacchanalia of violence and corrupt and greed because of the sort of underlying structural approach that the US took. So I'm not sure if there would have been a different politician or set of actors one could have supported, or simply a one reform or a set of reforms that could have been done, because this was a much deeper structural problem that I think the roots of it lie actually in Washington, not in Afghanistan.
Just to add to that, I recently published a chapter in a collection by Duke University Press called Decolonizing Afghanistan, which is actually available for free online through open access. And in it, I build on actually some of Anand's doctoral work, which he's never published, unfortunately, but it's really fascinating stuff. And so I think what we're both exploring is the way that when you have this sort of spending that goes to the periphery of the country rather than through the central state, it can create certain kinds of structural dynamics that affect how that state can then operate, how it can govern. And I use the example of Kandahar province, but in my chapter, but it's basically a story of how power in Kandahar was determined by access to the U.S. forces, to the base, to contracts. And you had this struggle between Gullah Shirzai, one local power broker, and the Karzais, Hamid in Kabul, but also his brother Ahmed Wali Karzai. And they're fighting this battle for control of contracts. It's not Kabul that's determining who's powerful in Kandahar. It's this local corrupt economy, right? Where they're struggling, using sort of mafia tactics against each other. And it's an example of how, again, like the state has no choice really but to participate in this kind of terrain of corruption if it's going to wrest control of these peripheral political economies based around international spending. But in doing so, of course, you create a kind of neo-patrimonial governance, aka corruption, a mix of bureaucratic and personal control, where that undermines the whole nation building project in general. And so I think understanding, like I think looking at these kinds of dynamics and also understanding them in terms of the comparative literature, because these exist in other contexts, and the scholars who describe them in, for example, Africa, helps us get a little bit beyond the kind of language of like choices and decisions. And did we make the wrong policy choice? Why wasn't there political will? Why was Karzai so corrupt? We can understand the deeper structures that drove some of these processes.
A question here from Kirk Anderson. This is something that's often been raised in 2021. Could the gains made be sustained if we had kept 5,000 troops in Afghanistan forever and maybe force a signing agreement with the Taliban to give them a piece of the country?
I'm curious what Matt thinks. I think that the Taliban would be unwilling to accept a deal that would be some portion of the country, and the reason for that is because their negotiating position by 2021 was pretty favorable towards them. Right now, in 2001, maybe 2002, maybe, but by 2021, I don't think the U.S. had much leverage to be able to do that. Now, alternatively, the U.S. could have probably kept 5 or 10,000 troops on the ground and just fought a war in perpetuity, and there would be lots of dead Afghans, and there would be gains in the cities. That I think is possible, but I'm more skeptical of the Taliban agreeing to some kind of partition.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Matt.
I
Yeah.
agree. I think that was basically one of the options that was considered under Biden, right? Was like just a perpetual counterterrorism presence, and I think it would have been possible to stabilize the republic for longer, and it's hard to say what, if anything, would have changed in like a deeper sense that would have either allowed it to make gains against the Taliban or would have caused it to collapse. But the agreement essentially, the reason we pulled those troops out is because we didn't want the Taliban to attack them, and that was basically the deal that was made with the Taliban by the Trump administration. Um, so that choice was foreclosed, before Biden came in.
A question here from Nick Walk. I've heard the discussions that State Department initiatives in promoting liberal democratic policies and then Defense Department initiatives in eliminating targets and threats were ultimately in opposition. Is this a sense that people had on the ground? That is, I'll add a word or two. Did Afghans on the ground have a sense of divisions in foreign and U.S. assistance related to the country that were significant to what happened on the ground?
Well, it depends, of course, which Afghans you talk to, but especially those who live in the war zones, areas where the war was the most intense. I think what you found often was just perplexity. They couldn't understand why the world, the most powerful empire, military actor the world's ever seen, coming to one of the poorest countries in the world. Why were they killing the wrong people? Why were they dropping bombs on the wrong people? Why weren't they able to defeat the Taliban? It all seemed impossible to understand. I don't think most Afghans had insight into the various divisions between branches of the U.S. government. So instead, you often get conspiracy theories. Sometimes people are just grasping and trying to understand how could this be the case. I mean, the number of times the U.S. killed one of its allies, and then I would go and talk to their family members or their constituents, and they wouldn't believe that this was a mistake. They said this has to be part of some kind of deeper design. Maybe the U.S. is secretly supporting the Taliban, which, as Matt mentioned, actually wasn't so secret. They were inadvertently supporting the Taliban at times through contracts. So I think for most Afghans, it was very difficult to grasp. But I don't know, Matt, maybe in Kabul, other Afghans may have had a different view.
Yeah, I think that's more or less correct. I'm not sure I actually understood the original question, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it has to do with to what degree do Afghans have any sense of these divided, aspects of U.S. policy, supporting on the one hand democratic
Oh,
practices and reconstruction of infrastructure, education, healthcare, and then this brutal war that was also being prosecuted at the same time.
well, I think that the very idea of democracy became discredited for many Afghans. It was not. I don't think that a lot of Afghans saw what that meant, especially outside the cities, and they thought that it was corrupt. I mean, it was almost like a curse word for some people.
Here's a comment from Elham Mansouri, an Afghan student at ASU, describing as a victim of the war and asking a question. It's sort of long. We must not forget that America appointed people like Zalmay Khalilzad, who's you all know is both a special envoy and also the ambassador, who lobbied for the Taliban in front of the U.S. government, and in the end, led to this particular agreement. He was key to the Trump agreement that led to the decision to remove troops. Could you reflect on that? How much did it matter that there were specific individuals, and to what degree did the Trump administration say give away everything to the Taliban?
Well, I think it does matter. Personal relationships matter, but it's hard for me to say that there was a lot of other options open to the administration at the time. Like, they wanted to get out of Afghanistan, so they had to find some kind of face-saving solution. Now, would it have been better to just leave without doing a deal, that had demoralizing effects on the Afghan government? Maybe, but when you think about all the deeper problems that we've spent this whole 45 minutes talking about, I don't know how much individual decisions by people in the negotiation process really changed substantively the paths that were available for this conflict to end.
Yeah, I mean, you hear people saying that the mistake was the U.S. should have enforced a deal between the Afghan government and the Taliban, right? But that assumes that the Afghan government was a sovereign, independent actor, and it wasn't. The Taliban understood this always, that the government of Afghanistan was a Potemkin government that you just The moment that the support of air power or finances goes away, the thing collapses, right? It didn't have real legitimacy on the ground outside of small areas. And so, like I think there was a recognition by the people in power that are making these deals that they could that's not going to get them very far. I think what happened though was with the Biden administration is that on the one hand, they wanted to get out of Afghanistan. On the other hand, they did believe their own uh, mythology that the government was a sovereign entity. So they somehow have this fantasy that they're going to withdraw, and then there's going to be maybe fighting between the government and the Taliban, and then eventually things would settle down. There'll be some kind of deal, right? And that was a bit of drinking their own Kool-Aid. The reality is the government was not an independent entity, and that's what history shows in September 2021.
Nor were they included in that negotiation process, which is itself interesting.
Well,
Well,
that's what I
but that's the Taliban. I mean, the Taliban were unwilling to negotiate with the Afghan government, right? That was their strategy. So there was no way the U.S. would have liked for the Taliban and the Republic to make a deal to sit down, but the Taliban, understood that they wanted to wait out the U.S. The U.S. was eager to leave, and there's no reason for them to concede that. Um, so the question is really, I think, whether or not there would have been some kind of bridge solution that would have allowed the Afghan government, the Republic, to fundamentally reconfigure itself from what it was, which is this kind of rentier apparatus who that was primarily concerned with battling each other for access to rents and power coming from the international occupation, right? Into something that was more cohesive, more willing to make sacrifices and genuinely mobilize people to fight the other side. And they realized it far too late. I mean, up in the last minute, all of these power brokers were at each other's throats in Kabul. And and so, would there have been some kind of bridge solution that would have allowed, the Northerners to mobilize their people to purge the, maybe a military coup that would have purged some of the government and, maybe, but then again, that would have probably just led to an intensified civil war with the Taliban, and I'm not sure that would have been better for the people of Afghanistan at that point.
exactly. I mean, there's not like there was any sense of esprit de corps in the Afghan government side, and that's not just because they happen to be terrible people, but because that's the nature of the government that the United States created. The U.S. created this government in its own image, based on handing out contracts, based on rents, as Matt said. So to expect that you create a government in that mode, and for it to then act in a different way, I think would be unrealistic. And that's what history shows what happened.
Interesting question here from Justin Parkin saying, how has the current Taliban rule been different from the first time around? Have there been any improvements?
Matt, you've been there more recently. Why don't you take that one?
I think there's definitely been improvements over the 90s. I mean, there hasn't been the same degree, I think, of like brutal coercion of the civilian population. They've been more, I think, tolerant of some of the social changes that have happened in Afghanistan. They're not ripping cassettes out of people's car or flogging women in the street for what they're wearing. But of course, there's a lot of women aren't allowed to go to university. There is terrible repression that's happening. It's just arguably an improvement over the 90s. In many ways, there's a lot of interesting continuities, and one of the most remarkable ones is the stability of the Taliban government. The 90s Taliban regime and then the current one are really the only real periods of state consolidation and stability that Afghanistan's had since the 1978 communist revolution. So if we I think in that respect we shouldn't be so surprised that the government has lasted 4 years now, and that they will continue to last in the future.
What do you think accounts for that? What aspects of Taliban rule make it capable of this level of stability?
Well, one important thing is that they are not so heavily dependent on rents in the same way that the previous government was. Now, they do rely on foreign aid quite a bit for some basic social services, but it's not to the extreme extents that the previous government was relying on it. A lot of the dynamics that we've been talking about today, of the contracting, of incentivizing local elites to fight against each other, none of that exists. The Taliban is and has been probably the only national movement to emerge in Afghanistan in the last 50 years. The Mujahideen groups that fought in the 80s were subnational for the most part. Even groups that had a national presence, they were really a collection of networks and a collection of factions fighting under one banner, right? Whereas the Taliban are much more of a national project. And part of that is that they appeal to Islam, but part of that too is that they emerged out of the experience of civil war against these other Mujahideen groups. So they've been very conscious when they were in power in the 90s and in today to not allow various individuals to accrue power in various positions. So they're always rotating people, rotating governors, rotating different people, trying to create more of a bureaucracy, state bureaucracy. I think there are all of these reasons. And the other reason is that there's no war. They're not, there's brutal repression for sure, but nobody's, for the most part, people aren't going to sleep and waking up in the middle of the night because masked men are breaking into their homes and taking away their loved ones.
So
They have deals
for
with local
Afghan,
leaders. Yeah.
based on that, for Afghans living in the countryside, where you both did really groundbreaking reporting when that wasn't being covered adequately, um, how does daily life compare in the now that the conflict is not happening? Can you
Matt,
compare positively the situation?
Matt, you've been there recently,
Yeah,
so
yeah, I think it's, I mean, I have been there a bunch over the last 4 years, and I think there's a contrast between Kabul and the countryside, especially in rural Pashtun areas, is stark in terms of people's attitudes. I mean, it's really very grim in Kabul. There's a economic crisis. Um, People are generally not as supportive of the Taliban, although there are people who do support the Taliban. Um, but it's grim. Whereas, and of course, and especially, women, the middle class women who were a smaller proportion of Afghan women, but an important one, they've been devastated. They've lost access to higher education, to jobs, and that's really remarkable in a place like Kabul and as well in other cities like Herat or Mazar. But when you go to the rural areas, and don't forget, most of the country still lives in rural areas. Uh, Things are different. People's attitudes are different. They are very happy that the conflict has ended. If you go to places where they're plowing fields that used to be, minefields or no man's land, um, they're able to conduct their harvests. They live much more socially conservative lives. So for the most part, the Taliban haven't imposed, drastic social changes on them. Um, it really is a tale of two countries, which is, the story of the last 20 years.
Um, you've both had really exceptionally accomplished careers, a lot related to work you've done in Afghanistan, but also other work. I'm wondering, we probably have some journalism students and other students here in the audience. Um, can you give an overview or some tips or just any sense of what individuals might do to build their own careers, to advance their own investigative work in the world that we're in today, whether in Afghanistan or just somewhere else, wherever is the current?
Well, I would say that, the most important thing you can do if you want to write about a region or a country is to learn the language. And it was often always surprised me how few reporters in Afghanistan, foreign reporters that is, did so. And it, not only does it give you a much greater insight into a culture and an ability to have strong relationships with people there. But as a freelancer, it's very helpful because you're not having to pay for a translator, so you can do longer, more sustained work with the kind of meager assignments and expenses that are available to you when you're starting out, which was what I did.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I think you should really strive to try to become an expert in the topic that you're reporting on. And that means, in addition to learning the languages, it means really delving deep into the literature that pertains to the subject, the academic literature, uh, every fiction, whatever it may be. You really want to try to read everything you can get your hands on about your subject. I know there's a model of journalism that, you report and then you call up the expert at the university to get a quote, and that nothing wrong with that. And that happens especially for shorter pieces. But if you want to do more long form, in-depth reporting, you want to really cultivate a beat by by striving towards expertise. And of course, any of us probably ever get there because it maybe takes many years of study, but even having that orientation, I think is very important, because then you'll begin to see connections and patterns. And when you start interviewing people, you'll begin to know what kind of questions to ask. I can't remember, I tell you, like, a number of times I'd go to a village and interview somebody, and the interview could have gone one way if I just asked them to expect the questions one would expect, but often I would have read everything I can get my hands on about that village or that area. And so I would bring up, oh, tell me about so and so, the local strongman. And the village and the person who you're interviewing often doesn't bring them up themselves, but when you bring it up, then it opens up a whole new vista of possibilities. So I think really trying to develop expertise is important.
To what degree do you think that the lack of that kind of expertise, which is understandable for so many reporters because it takes the kind of time commitment you've both put into Afghanistan, learning the language, traveling remotely, not being on the same kind of deadlines because of your independent status, et cetera. To what degree do you think the general reporting that relied on embeds and going to press conferences, how much did that affect the way in which Americans understood Afghanistan?
There's no question that that was part of the reason why it took so long to see why these interventions were bound to fail, why the surge turned out to be a colossal waste of money and lives. It's because people were going to embeds and press conferences where they were being fed um, misleading narratives and information, bullshit basically, by um, institutions, experts, generals, people that they had been trained to respect.
But this is also nothing particularly new, right? If we think of, say, Vietnam or other kinds of reporting issues, are there any sort of lessons learned about how we could get clearer information about the next crisis, which no doubt will come down the pike?
I mean, I think actually the lesson is that we can't get clear information about crises while they're happening. I think there's like powerful forces that prevent us from properly understanding a conflict when it's not in the interest of, the establishment power centers to understand it. Like there was a period where I saw this very clearly with my work. When I did my first article on Razik, people were interested, and then in 2009, but by the time the surge was sort of in place and working the way it did, people weren't interested in learning about his human rights abuses anymore, because to contemplate them would be having to reevaluate, what they'd already committed to do. And then, of course, once it's all gone, then nowadays we can publish articles about how bad Razik was, and everyone's interested and shaking their heads about it. So I think that's the problem, is that there's forces at work, not to sound too conspiratorial, but there are processes at work that uh, create an epistemology around conflicts that we can be aware of, but not change fundamentally.
Yeah, and in addition to that, I totally agree. But also, I think it's important to try to look at some of our own ideological presuppositions and biases that we bring to the table. I mean, most journalists are, broadly speaking, are liberals of some sort, and we go to a place like Afghanistan where there's a tiny minority of the population that is more liberal, urban. Some of them are even secular, and it becomes easier to identify with them versus folks in the countryside who are frankly quite different in their attitudes and dispositions towards somebody like me or you or Matt, right? And it can be challenging. It can be a little difficult to put yourself in that situation, to sit with people who are very socially conservative and have a very different understanding of a lot of these basic questions, and try to see things from their point of view, even if you may not always agree with their worldview. And so I think it's hard to do, but especially in a place like Afghanistan, which, as Matt said, is really a tale of two countries, to be able to better report on the conflict and to understand the country, I think one needs to try to do that.
Mhm. And I would just add that maybe one technique for getting around this kind of these blind spots that are created by a war try to transpose the lessons from or another conflict to a different one. So it may be that now the owl of Minerva is flying at dusk with Afghanistan, and we see now how we were wrong all along. But as it's far too late to do anything about it. But perhaps we can apply these lessons to what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Gaza, what may soon be happening in Venezuela.
Thank you both so much. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. It's really been a pleasure to host you.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.